when push comes to shove, you want to think very hard about whether you want to be in a situation where you cannot, no matter what resources you have at your disposal, get timely treatment for your wife's cancer.
That's true, but to your point before, we do a wallet biopsy here. So you're rationing care by one metric or another. The question is, do you ration it based on need, or do you ration it based on wealth?
You can't ration it based on need. You can't ration anything based on need. And that's another misapprehension on the Marxist side. Who the hell determines need? How in the world do you determine need?
Somebody's
Like, how do
bleeding
you
out in the
determine
emergency room. I think they take precedence.
That's a facile answer.
Is it?
I'm asking a serious question.
I thought I was giving a serious answer.
No, you're not, because when you're trying to parcel out need, you're dealing with multiple serious existential catastrophes simultaneously. And we don't know how to adjudicate the provision of resources based on need. So I can give you an example of that. Imagine you have a kid who's single parent mother, minority, deprived family, unbelievably academically gifted and capable of benefiting from a high quality, publicly funded education. Or you have a kid who's got a form of cancer that is likely to be painful and produce protracted suffering over a lengthy period of time. You've got a finite pool of money. How in the world do you adjudicate between those two situations? And the answer is you can't. And that's only two situations, not the million situations that actually exist. And the way we do adjudicate between those situations is we use money. That is the mechanism for adjudication. And you might say, well, it produces all sorts of unfair consequences. And the response to that is, yeah, that's for sure. But that's not the issue. The issue is what makes you think you can do better?
This is, I feel bad to keep pausing when it's only me that can be talking right now, but I don't want to let this part go by, because this is really a jaw-droppingly awful argument, right? Because what is he saying? Kyle's response was, well, look, here's a clear case of something we could all agree is greater need that should take precedence over, non-emergency medical situations. And Peterson says, oh, that's facile, because there are other cases where it could be a much harder determination, who has greater need, which, true enough. But then the conclusion he's drawing from there are other cases in which it might be much harder to decide who has a greater need is therefore we should just let money determine it, which is a flying logical leap into like nihilism, right? I mean, that is a insane conclusion to draw from that premise, right? That like, yeah, there are very easy cases like Kyle's where it's very clear who needs resources more in medical system. There are other cases where it could be a much harder evaluation who needs it more. So therefore, because there are cases where it might be hard to determine, we should just throw it out, and we should just throw out any concern with need and just let rich people cut to the head of the line because of their money. I mean, that's pretty astonishing that Peterson thinks that's a real argument, and that what Kyle said is facile, that's not.
I'd also like to point out how deeply insulting that is to the entire Western tradition, because philosophers going back to Aristotle pointed out that there are ways of adjudicating these questions. And in an Aristotelian vein, we can point out that when it comes to these moral issues, especially in complex cases, we can only answer them with the kind of accuracy that the subject permits. But that doesn't mean we can't get closer to a better answer than just sitting there and saying, well, let the chaos of what people want to spend their money on decide how it is that society should spend its meek resources, right? If anything, the kind of one being facile here is him, because he thinks that when you are confronted with a handful of difficult cases, you just have to throw up your hands in the air and say, well, world's too complicated, so we just have to let the chips of life fall where they lie, right? And I would say that anybody who has any kind of balls would say that we can do a little bit better than that.
It really is just like astonishingly bad. That saying like, okay, if you are trying to determine it, if you were trying to ration healthcare resources on the basis of need, you will sometimes get it wrong because like it's really complicated and hard in some cases to determine that. Again, fair enough. I'm with him so far, right? But therefore, we shouldn't even try. Like, really? Like that? That you'll sometimes get it wrong. Therefore, you should throw that overboard in favor of just in terms of just like letting whoever has the most money buy their way to the front of the line. I mean, like, surely I would think you could say, like, yes, human systems are fallible. Like attempting to ration on the basis of need, there's no guarantee that you'll always, you'll get it right 100% of the time. But like, if you're just rationing on the basis of money, I mean, what percentage of the time do you think you'll get right after that? I mean, what was really facile is what he says at the end of his presentation of that argument. It's like, oh, well, will you get will that sometimes lead to things being really unfair? Well, you betcha. It's like, well, okay, but you just haven't completed your argument, right? You've told us this system is fallible, therefore let's use this one instead, where the one you want to use instead is one that's not even aiming at that goal. I mean, like, and it's also just like, yeah, you mentioned philosophers going back to Aristotle, trying to think about how to, determine greater need and all that. And fair enough. But I mean, like, also at a more mundane level.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. It is a hard problem, right? And there are tough cases.
Totally, right? But there are also like, that's also why like hospitals have ethics boards, right? Like that it's not like countries that have taken healthcare out of the market entirely just have no systems for trying to adjudicate those things, right? They might not be perfect systems, but they do. I mean, they have I would much rather, have, I mean, I remember thinking this back when Obamacare was first being debated, and there was this minute there where like, Sarah Palin and people like that kept talking about death panels. And I remember thinking and telling people at the time, it's like, look, I mean, it's kind of funny because it's like, yeah, like healthcare, you are dealing with life and death, right? You're deciding how to distribute potentially life-saving resources. Obviously, the more money, the bigger the share of society's resources that's going to healthcare, the sort of further out those limits are going to be. And I'm, very enthusiastically in favor of expanding them. But like, but yeah, you are going to have to make life and death decisions about who gets care, given that you don't have infinite resources to go around. But it's like, I would actually much rather those decisions be made by panels of subject matter experts, right? Who might not always get it right, than just like letting rich people bribe their way to get into the front of the line ahead of people with obviously greater need.
No, absolutely. And I think in some circumstances that would be appropriate, right? I do think that doctors, for instance, should tend to make the calls when it comes to the allocation of things like medical resources. But I think the general socialist intuition, and I say general socialist intuition because there are exceptional cases where I don't think this should be extended to, like medical instances, right? Is that generally speaking, these questions are very complicated and they don't always permit of the right answer. And so what you want to have a society that's pretty thoroughly democratized so that you don't have nodes of power that allow certain people to make decisions about how you're going to allocate resources that will ultimately privilege their interests over the interests of everybody.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that democratic decision-making is always going to hit on the best answer. And that's one of the reasons why you need to have, for instance, a system of rights that protects people against certain bad majoritarian impulses. But democracy is more likely to get the right answer than various forms of authoritarian rule.
No, I think that's right. I think broad policies about that should be set by democratic deliberation. I think particular applications, I mean, I do think like, I generally have that socialist impulse that you're talking about to sort of resist, technocratic, solutions to things, but like also legitimately, like, I didn't go to med school. I think,
totally.
I'm prepared to defer to a certain extent to the like judgments of people who did about like which kinds of medical interventions are likely to pay off and all of that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And again, this is why I think that there are exceptions to this, right? And we need to be very careful in demarcating them. But I do have confidence that we can make these kinds of adjudications about where it is appropriate and where it's not, right? But one of the points that I want to make when it comes to economic issues is the idea that you find in socialism that because how it is that we distribute resources just at the kind of macrological level is so impactful on everyone, it's deeply unfair to allow nodes of power to be concentrated so that some people get to make decisions about where tremendous amounts of resources go. Everyone should be able to have a say in making these kinds of judgment calls. And again, that doesn't mean that we're always going to make the right decision, but you're far more likely to get a better outcome by allowing people to decide democratically how it is that the economy is going to be organized than allowing Jeff Bezos and a handful of other people get to dictate that.
Yeah.
My cat wanted to cameo. Say hi.
Hey, Kitty. I am definitely with you on all of that. And I think the larger point here, I mean, just structurally, is like, okay, look, if you think about anything ranging from like something like really technocratic, where like the actual broad policies are being
Are
largely
you saying you're not with her, Ben?
yeah, exactly, right. So like, but like anything ranging from that, right, like a really technocratic way of running the health system, where like there are really very few nodes for like the larger popular will to like make its voice heard on that stuff. Anything through that, through like some like really radically democratic state with a national healthcare system where there are lots of ways, right, for public opinion to shape what the broad policies are. Like, there's a lot you could say about which to prefer and like where in that spectrum you should want to be and all that stuff. But like, I think the larger point, as far as Jordan's argument here, is like, look, out of all the possible ways to ration care, given ultimately scarce resources, which every system's resources are ultimately scarce, right? They're not unlimited. So you would really have to try very hard to come up with a worse way to ration, like the resources and life-saving medical care than just like, well, whoever has the most money wins. Like, I mean, like I would be more comfortable with almost literally any system other than that.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to sit there and be Aristotle to sit there to point out that in the middle of a pandemic, when millions of people are going hungry, maybe it's not the best idea for Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and a handful of other billionaires to be launching themselves into space to the tune of 30 billion a pop because, and I quote Jeff Bezos here, he just can't think of anything else to spend his money on, right? You can probably sit there and think, well, if you don't have any ideas about how that money should be spent, I certainly have a few about where it can be better allocated. Get Peter Singer in here, right? He'll give you a fucking index up to your yin yang about what this money can go to, right? And the idea that, there's no way of actually starting at a very general level, making demarcations about the kind of things that we prioritize, and then moving down with higher levels of specialization to more specific and more penumbral problems is what's really farcical about this whole thing. Because that's what philosophers, and for that matter, statesmen, have been doing for hundreds of years. And that's what democracies have been doing for at least several decades now. And they've been doing it pretty successfully.
Yeah. And again, like the worst call that's going to be made because like you've instituted some like very terribly wrong-headed policies to guide the decisions of hospital boards, or the hospital boards themselves are making bad, like the worst policies would really have a hard time being worse in their outcomes than just like than just like whoever comes from money gets to buy their way to the head of the line.
Yeah. If you happen to be lucky enough to inherit a fucking diamond mine from your apartheid dad, then you get to call the shots. Sorry, it's just the way that the lobster gods have ordained it.
Let's see if we can get in like 5 more minutes here.
And there is no evidence that you can do better. And so the idea that need should take precedence, like that's fine in principle, although it's not. Who in the world could possibly adjudicate need? And that's what they tried to do with the central planning committees in the Soviet Union when they were trying to make pricing decisions. And sometimes the Soviet central planners had to make like 5,000 pricing decisions a day. And they were trying to adjudicate need. Do we need more nails or do we need more hypodermic needles. Well, how in the world, and that's like 2 decisions, not 5,000. How in the world are you possibly going to compute that?
You know, Soviet planet really did have a lot of problems. He's not wrong about that, but they're in the world right now, right? There are any number of publicly owned healthcare systems that are actually quite successfully planned outside of the market, right? I mean, I realize it's complicated, and there have been Thatcherite reforms over the decades that have chipped away at it, but I mean, like broadly speaking, right? I mean, the National Health Service in Britain is nationally planned, and it's so popular that even conservative politicians have to pretend that they want to preserve it, and they would never, win another election. So just sort of being like, well, if we had, if we tried to plan healthcare, then then it would be just like the Soviet Union, like as if England didn't also exist.
I know Jeremy Gilbert wrote a really good book on 21st century socialism, but one of the points that he makes that was just scathing was that it's really telling that the most socialist institution in the United Kingdom is far and away the most popular one.
Yeah.
And this is the other problem that the Marxists have in particular. The free market system is a giant computational device, distributed computational device, involving billions of calculations per second, trying to compute the transforming horizon of the future. And it can't be replaced by central planning, not even in principle.
But don't you think there are some issues with that because profit's at the core of it? So just to push back a little bit, a study came out, Scientific American reported on this recently. If the United States had a universal healthcare system, like Canada, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, 330,000 more lives could have been saved. So in some ways, I agree
Well,
that the free
I
market
listened to a
is
study
very
like that,
efficient.
and I think no one in the world, there's no one in the world who can possibly produce a study like that with valid outcomes.
You don't think that
And
that's
the fact
somewhat
that
empirical?
Scientific American reported it, not in the least. I've done
Really?
150, I've done 100 published studies. I know exactly how they work. And there's no possible way that you can produce a
It's an amazing
scientific
claim
study
just
with that
now.
kind of conclusion, not unless you build it in from the beginning. There's too many variables to take into account.
I know,
So
especially
we're
when it's
not
like, well, I don't
also
have to
confused.
read the damn thing. I know. I've done 150 studies before, so
Yeah,
a
you've
priori, I've intuited this.
done some small scale studies in psychology. Therefore, you could pronounce the limits of human knowledge on this.
Well, let's be clear also. This is a man, again, who points out in Maps of Meaning that he's talking about the existence of what makes up the world in a more than metaphysical sense. Yet again, lecturing people, making a far narrower set of claims on why it is that they should show some epistemic humility. So maybe he should take some of his own advice at various different points and actually read the article and then make an assessment on that basis.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like he's just like the idea that he could just. I mean, this is the same thing as what you were telling me about earlier, the video to the Muslims, where he's like, I've thought about your problem, and you should, the Sunnis and the Shiites, they should write each other, they should write each other some pen pal letters, and they'll sort through this. It's like that. It's like just the degree of arrogance on display here. That it's like, nope, I've got all this figured out, right? I know. I've done some studies in a completely different field, of a completely different type. Therefore, I know in advance of having to even glance at the findings that this can't possibly be a legitimate study. Although, by the way, I liked those freedom rankings.
Okay. Well, I mean, he does this kind of thing quite a bit now. I mean, a couple of weeks before he got banned, he tweeted out something nasty. I think it was also about Scientific American, where a researcher published an article about how the way that our faces contort in certain circumstances aren't necessarily indicatory of our emotions, because there are a lot of factors for why it is that determine why it is that our faces contort in various different ways. Some of them are emotional, some of them are environmental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And she claimed that Darwin was wrong on that basis. And he wrote about this just screaming, being like, this who knows who in Scientific American just is saying now that Darwin is wrong. What a ridiculous claim. And it turns out that she's the world expert at Northeastern Europe University, who specializes in just this topic, right? How it is that faces respond to emotional and environmental stimuli. And even some of his fans were just like, maybe you should actually fucking read the article before you just decide it's bullshit, because coming from the field of clinical psychology, I know what makes a good study, and I know how it is that people's faces respond, and I know that this woman absolutely just has to be a nobody. They also pointed out that she's been cited vastly more than he has over the course of her career, as you might be if you happen to be the world expert in a subject matter, right?
Yeah, it's also just I think it's pretty revealing that like Jordan Peterson has this kind of like great books view of intellectual history and of and just of, I don't know, science, everything, right? That like, he reveres like big important books, except for ones that were written by Marx, that were from a really long time ago. And so like that's why he's doing this weird thing where he's like sort of a Christian sometimes, but he also loves Nietzsche, right? That like because it's like, no, that's like fancy old great books, right? That can't be bad, right? Like there must be some way of ultimately reconciling all this, right? So it's like Darwin is in the fancy old great books list, right? So it's like it doesn't matter, like it doesn't matter what the evidence is. He doesn't need to look at it, he just knows that it's wrong.
I know, and it's a very clear bit of favoritism here, right? And you see that all the time. I mean, you and I have pointed this out before, but it's very bizarre that Marx has to be continuously condemned for anticipating totalitarianism. But Heidegger and now Alexander fucking Dugin get a hard pass, right? Because they're real philosophers, even though they sit there and they actually actively participated in various totalitarian and authoritarian governments. So,
yeah, right. I mean, that actually being a member of the Nazi Party and a rector of your university under the Nazis.
yeah, and sitting there being like, by the way, my philosophy has a lot to do with Nazism. That might be a clue that you'd sit there and think to yourself, like, wow, maybe I should interrogate this a little bit more closely.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.